They laughed the moment her voice cracked. It wasn't a big mistake. She didn't forget her lines. She didn't say anything outrageous. She simply tried to speak while holding back tears, and that small tremor in her voice was enough. A few chuckles started in the back. Someone whispered something sharp and clever. Then the sound spread, row by row, like a ripple across water. She stood there, frozen for half a second, as if her body needed time to process what was happening. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the paper she was holding. The lights felt hotter. The room felt smaller. Every pair of eyes suddenly seemed brighter, sharper, watching not to understand her, but to measure her. The first laugh was quiet. The second was louder. By the third, it was no longer accidental. It was collective. She blinked quickly, trying to steady herself. Her throat burned. She swallowed and tried again, repeating the sentence she had just begun. This time her voice came out thinner, stretched tight with effort. That only made it worse. A few people didn't even try to hide their smiles. Someone nudged the person next to them. A phone lifted slightly, as if the moment was worth recording. In that instant, the room stopped being a place of listening and became a stage for judgment. They didn't know what it had taken for her to stand there. They didn't know she had rewritten her speech 3 times the night before. They didn't know she had practiced in front of a mirror, correcting her posture, slowing her breathing, telling herself she could do it. They didn't know that just walking up to that podium had felt like climbing a mountain she had been avoiding for years. All they saw was a girl with tears in her eyes. And to them, that was weakness. Her shoulders straightened slightly, not out of confidence, but out of instinct. When people feel cornered, they either shrink or stiffen. She chose to stiffen. Her jaw tightened. She pressed her lips together for a brief second, as if physically holding her emotions in place. The laughter didn't come from cruelty alone. Some of it came from discomfort, some from habit, some from the easy reflex of following the crowd. It is simpler to laugh than to sit in someone else's pain. Simpler to treat vulnerability as a spectacle than to recognize it as courage. But in that moment, none of those distinctions mattered to her. What she heard was rejection. What she felt was exposure. She looked down at her notes, though the words were starting to blur. A single tear slipped free despite her effort to hold it back. That was when the laughter peaked. Not wild, not hysterical, but loud enough to fill the silence she had hoped to control. Time seemed to slow. She became aware of the smallest details. The hum of the air conditioner, the shuffle of a shoe against the floor, the faint buzz of a phone vibrating somewhere in the audience. It was strange how clearly she could hear everything except kindness. For a brief second, she considered walking away. The exit was only a few steps down the aisle. She imagined the relief of sitting back down, disappearing into her chair, letting someone else take the spotlight. No more eyes, no more laughter, but something kept her rooted in place. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was the quiet realization that if she walked away now, the laughter would follow her far longer than the moment itself. She lifted her head again. Her eyes were red, her expression raw, but there was something new in it. Not confidence yet, not strength in the heroic sense, just resolve. The kind that forms when embarrassment burns so deeply that fear starts to fade. The room hadn't noticed the shift. They were still caught in the aftershock of their own amusement. A few laughs lingered. A few whispers continued. They thought the moment belonged to them. They thought the sound of their laughter had defined her. They didn't realize it had defined them. She wasn't crying because she was weak. She was crying because she had carried too much for too long. And this was the first time she had tried to put it into words in front of people who never bothered to ask what she was holding. For weeks, maybe even months, she had been shrinking herself to fit into rooms that were never built with her in mind. Smiling when she felt dismissed, nodding when she was interrupted, staying quiet when her ideas were brushed aside and later repeated by someone else who received applause for the same words. Each small moment seemed harmless on its own, but together they stacked up like invisible weight pressing against her chest. The day she stood there speaking, it wasn't just about that single topic. It was about every time she had been told she was too sensitive for reacting to something that hurt. It was about every side comment disguised as a joke. It was about the way people labeled her emotional whenever she spoke with passion, as if caring deeply was a flaw instead of a strength. She had decided to speak because staying silent had started to feel heavier than the risk of being heard. The night before, she barely slept. She replayed conversations in her head, wondering if she had misunderstood them. Maybe they hadn't meant to exclude her. Maybe she had overreacted. Maybe the problem was her. That doubt had been living in her mind for years, growing quietly, fed by small dismissals and subtle slights that were easy to deny but hard to forget. Her tears were not sudden. They were delayed. When she began speaking, she wasn't trying to accuse anyone. She was trying to explain how certain comments and behaviors had affected her. She wanted to describe what it felt like to sit in a meeting and be talked over, to suggest an idea and watch it fall flat, only to see it celebrated when repeated by someone else, to carry responsibility without recognition, to constantly question whether she deserved her place in the room. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was asking for awareness. But as she spoke, something inside her cracked. Saying the words out loud made them real in a way thinking about them never had. The careful composure she had practiced began to slip. Her voice trembled not because she hadn't prepared, but because the truth felt heavier once it was exposed to the air. She thought she could control it. She thought she could present her feelings neatly, packaged in calm language and steady tone, so they would be easier to accept. Instead, emotion rose up faster than she expected. Her throat tightened. Her eyes stung. The vulnerability she had tried to manage spilled over in front of everyone. That was when the laughter began. They didn't see the months of restraint behind that tear. They didn't see the countless times she had swallowed her frustration to keep the peace. They didn't see the way she had rehearsed her speech, carefully removing any sentence that might sound too harsh, too accusatory, too dramatic. They only saw the tear. They interpreted it as fragility, not as the overflow of someone who had been strong for too long. What made it worse was that she had warned herself about this possibility. She had stood in front of her mirror and practiced keeping her expression neutral. She had taken slow breaths, timing her pauses so her voice wouldn't waver. She had promised herself she would not cry, because she knew tears often overshadow the message. People focus on the emotion and ignore the substance. And yet, despite all that preparation, her body responded honestly. The tears came because she cared, because what she was describing wasn't theoretical. It was personal. It was lived. It was stitched into her daily experience in ways no one else in that room had taken the time to notice. She wasn't crying for attention. She was crying because she was tired of pretending that nothing bothered her. She was crying because she had finally chosen honesty over comfort. And honesty, when it has been suppressed for too long, rarely arrives in a perfectly controlled voice. Before she ever opened her mouth, they had already decided who she was. In their minds, she was the quiet one, the overly emotional one, the one who worked hard but didn't quite fit the image of leadership they were used to applauding. They had placed her in a category long before she stood at that podium, and once someone is labeled, every action they take is filtered through that label. When she stayed silent in meetings, they assumed she had nothing important to add. They never considered that she was choosing her words carefully or waiting for a pause that rarely came. When she spoke with conviction, they called it intensity. When someone else did the same, they called it confidence. They assumed she lacked resilience because she didn't raise her voice. They assumed she lacked authority because she didn't demand attention. They mistook her calmness for insecurity and her thoughtfulness for hesitation. What they didn't see was the discipline it took to remain composed in rooms where she was consistently underestimated. They assumed her kindness meant she would never push back. They assumed her patience meant she would always absorb the impact of careless remarks. They assumed she would continue to adjust herself to make others comfortable. Every small interaction reinforced the story they had written about her. If she stumbled over a word, it confirmed their belief that she wasn't strong under pressure. If she expressed concern about something, it became proof that she was too sensitive. If she succeeded quietly, they treated it as expected, nothing remarkable. They never questioned their assumptions because assumptions are comfortable. They allow people to simplify others into predictable characters. In their version of the story, she was not the protagonist. She was background. They assumed her tears meant she was breaking down. They assumed emotion meant a lack of control. They assumed vulnerability meant weakness. They didn't consider that vulnerability might require more courage than indifference. Some of them believed she had earned her position through luck. Others thought she was there because someone had been generous. A few may have thought she was competent, but not exceptional. Not someone who would challenge them. Not someone who would disrupt the dynamic they were used to. They assumed she didn't notice the subtle exclusions. The inside jokes she wasn't part of. The decisions made in conversations she was never invited to. The way credit shifted direction at just the right moment. They assumed she accepted all of it. The problem with assumptions is that they grow quietly. No one announces them out loud. No one says, "I have decided this is who you are." Instead, they show up in tone, in body language, in the way someone is interrupted mid-sentence or overlooked in a room full of raised hands. By the time she stood there speaking, those assumptions had hardened into belief. So when her voice shook, it fit the narrative they already carried. It confirmed what they thought they knew. It allowed them to dismiss her message without truly hearing it. Laughter became easier because it aligned with their expectations. They didn't pause to question whether their perception might be incomplete. They didn't ask themselves what kind of strength it takes to speak honestly about being underestimated in front of the very people who underestimate you. They assumed she would crumble under the weight of their reaction. They assumed embarrassment would silence her. They assumed that once laughter filled the room, she would retreat into the version of herself they were comfortable with. They didn't imagine that the person they had categorized so neatly might be more complex than their assumptions allowed. They didn't imagine that beneath the quiet exterior was someone who had been observing everything. Someone who understood the dynamics better than they realized. Someone who had endured enough to recognize that their laughter said more about them than it did about her. They assumed she was fragile because they had never taken the time to see her strength. They assumed they knew her story because they had never asked her to tell it. The turning point did not arrive with a dramatic gesture or a raised voice. It came in a quiet shift that most people in the room almost missed. After the laughter peaked and began to fade, she stopped trying to rush through her words. At first, it looked like hesitation. In reality, it was a decision. She lowered her notes. That single movement changed the energy in the room. Up until then, she had been reading carefully, following the script she prepared, trying to stay within safe boundaries. But something about the laughter made the script feel unnecessary. The careful phrasing, the softened language, the polite framing of uncomfortable truths no longer felt worth protecting. She took one slow breath. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just steady. The room was still unsettled, a few stray chuckles lingering, but curiosity began to replace amusement. People sensed a pause that didn't feel like surrender. When she spoke again, her voice was different. It was still soft, but it wasn't shaking. The tremor had given way to clarity. She wasn't trying to sound composed anymore. She was simply speaking. "I can't hear you," she said. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Those 3 words did what no raised tone could have done. They forced the room to confront itself. Laughter thrives when it feels unseen, when it blends into a crowd. But once acknowledged, it becomes individual, personal, harder to hide behind. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone looked down at their phone. Another crossed their arms, suddenly aware of their own expression. She didn't accuse them. She didn't attack. She didn't demand silence. She just continued, this time without looking at her notes. She explained that this was exactly what she had been talking about. Not just in theory, but in real time. The quick dismissal. The ease of turning someone's vulnerability into entertainment. The reflex to laugh instead of listen. Her voice gained steadiness not because she felt safe, but because she had nothing left to lose in that moment. The worst had already happened. They had laughed. The fear she carried about being judged had already come true. And strangely, that freed her. There is a certain kind of courage that appears only after embarrassment. When the illusion of perfection is gone, when the attempt to appear polished has failed, honesty becomes easier. She wasn't performing anymore. She was speaking from the center of the discomfort. She described how hard it is to share something personal in a room where you are not sure you belong. She described the exhaustion of constantly proving your value. She described the weight of being underestimated and the risk of speaking up anyway. The room grew quieter, not because she demanded it, but because they began to hear themselves in her words. The turning point was not loud. It was not marked by applause or gasps. It was marked by attention. People leaned forward slightly. The same faces that had been smiling moments earlier now looked uncertain. Not defensive, but reflective. The shift was subtle, like the change in air before a storm, when everything stills without warning. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was naming a pattern. And when patterns are named clearly, they become difficult to ignore. Someone in the front row nodded almost unconsciously. Another person's expression softened. The room was no longer united in laughter. It was divided between those who were reconsidering and those who were uncomfortable with the reconsideration. She maintained eye contact now, not aggressively, but intentionally. She let her gaze rest on different parts of the room, making it impossible to pretend the moment was abstract. The power dynamic had shifted. Moments earlier, the audience had control. Their reaction dictated the atmosphere. Now she held it, not because she overpowered them, but because she refused to retreat. Her tears were still visible, but they no longer defined her presence. They became part of her credibility rather than a symbol of fragility. The turning point was the realization that silence can be chosen. And in choosing not to shrink, she altered the entire direction of the room. The truth that changed the room was not complicated. It wasn't a shocking revelation or a secret exposed. It was simple, direct, and impossible to ignore once spoken clearly. She told them she had considered leaving. Not just walking off the stage in that moment, but stepping away from the team, the project, the space they all shared. She admitted that the constant dismissal, the subtle jokes, the feeling of being tolerated instead of valued, had made her question whether staying was worth it. That was the first shift. Until then, many of them had assumed she would always be there. Reliable, consistent, quietly handling responsibilities without complaint. The idea that she might choose to leave disrupted that comfort. Then she told them something else. She said she was the one who had stayed late to fix errors no one else noticed. She was the one who had rewritten proposals after feedback sessions that barely acknowledged her effort. She was the one who had smoothed over conflicts behind the scenes so meetings could feel calm and productive. She didn't say it with arrogance. She said it with clarity. There were details she mentioned that only someone deeply involved would know. Small decisions she had influenced. Problems she had quietly solved before they became visible. Opportunities she had identified and passed along without taking credit. As she spoke, people began to connect dots. The success they had grown comfortable with was not accidental. It was supported by work they had overlooked because it did not demand attention. It was supported by someone they had reduced to a stereotype. She explained that she had never asked for applause. She had never needed constant recognition. But respect was different. Being heard was different. Being treated as an equal was different. Her voice was steady now, not because the emotion had vanished, but because the message had sharpened. She said the laughter hurt, but not in the way they might think. It didn't hurt her pride. It confirmed her fear that vulnerability would be dismissed. It showed how quickly honesty can be turned into entertainment when people are uncomfortable with what it reveals. The room was silent, but it was a heavy silence. Not empty, not distracted. It carried awareness. She didn't blame anyone by name. She didn't single out specific comments or incidents. Instead, she described the pattern, the way small actions accumulate, the way repeated interruptions slowly erode confidence, the way dismissive humor can make someone feel invisible. She told them she had doubted herself more than she had doubted them, that for a long time, she believed she was overreacting, that she tried to adjust her tone, her delivery, even her personality to make it easier for others to accept her. That confession landed differently. People are prepared to defend themselves against accusations. They are less prepared when someone admits they internalized the problem instead. She said she was tired of shrinking to fit expectations that were never clearly stated but constantly enforced. Tired of softening her words to avoid being labeled. Tired of carrying responsibility quietly while others enjoyed visibility. Then came the truth that changed everything. She said she wasn't going to do that anymore. Not with anger. Not with a threat, just with certainty. She would continue to work hard. She would continue to contribute. But she would not minimize herself to protect someone else's comfort. She would speak directly. She would take credit when it was earned. She would call out dismissal when it happened. And if that made people uncomfortable, so be it. The air in the room felt different. What had started as a moment of embarrassment had transformed into a recalibration of power. They realized the laughter had not broken her. It had clarified her. They realized she was not asking for permission to be respected. She was stating an expectation. The truth was not dramatic. It was grounded. It was steady. It forced everyone listening to reconsider their role in what she had described. And in that silence, they understood that the version of her they had assumed was incomplete. Silence followed the laughter, but it was not empty. It was heavy, layered, and full of realization. After the initial reflex of amusement passed, the room felt the shift, as if a window had been opened and fresh air had swept through, unsettling everything that had felt comfortable moments before. The quiet was almost deafening because it demanded attention, reflection, and acknowledgement in a way laughter never could. For the first time, people began to notice not just the words she had spoken, but the presence she carried. It was impossible to ignore. The same presence they had dismissed, underestimated, or mocked. The silence forced them to confront the reality they had been avoiding. That she was not fragile, that she was not naive, that she had been observing, calculating, and enduring all along. The laughter had failed to mask that truth, and the quiet left space for it to breathe. She remained standing, not bowing her head, not retreating, not shrinking. Her tears had dried or at least faded, leaving only the steady beat of someone claiming their own space. Every eye in the room had a moment of hesitation, a subtle recognition that things were no longer as they had been. People shuffled in their seats, avoided eye contact, or stared uncomfortably, as if the silence itself carried weight heavier than any spoken word. The silence revealed something fundamental about human behavior. Laughter can be a shield, a weapon, a social glue, or a weaponized response to discomfort. But silence is harder to navigate. Silence exposes assumptions, highlights biases, and makes the audience aware of their complicity in the story that has been unfolding without them. Every smirk, every whisper, every glance that had accompanied the initial laughter now felt inadequate, even small and almost embarrassing in the stark quiet that had replaced it. Some felt the need to fill the silence. A cough, a shift in the chair, the rustle of a paper, tiny gestures that betrayed discomfort. Others remained still, eyes tracing the outline of her face, following her every movement, waiting for what might come next. The silence, in that sense, became a mirror. It reflected not just her courage, but also their own reactions, their own failure to recognize her worth earlier. In that quiet, the room began to change without anyone saying a word. The dynamics shifted subtly, imperceptibly at first. Where there had been a hierarchy of laughter, of dominance and dismissal, there was now an equality that could not be denied. People who had been ready to dismiss her now found themselves listening, internally recalibrating how they had treated her, questioning the assumptions they had clung to so comfortably. The silence demanded introspection. She didn't speak to fill the void. She allowed the silence to exist, knowing its power. Every second she remained standing, calm and present, intensified it. Silence became her statement, her authority, her invisible declaration that she would no longer be defined by others' amusement. The quietness forced a reckoning, an acknowledgement that presence and honesty are stronger than ridicule. Even the energy in the room changed. It shifted from the chaotic, scattered noise of laughter to a collective pause, a shared breath held, as if the air itself had thickened. People's attention sharpened. Their minds, once distracted by social posturing, now had to confront the reality in front of them. The silence was an unspoken command. Listen, witness, understand. In that silence, she gained a kind of power that laughter could never have provided. It was not domineering or aggressive. It was quiet, undeniable, and fundamentally transformative. It forced people to see her fully, beyond their preconceptions, beyond the superficial humor they had indulged in. They saw her resilience, her truth, her unwillingness to be diminished. The silence also carried a subtle lesson about consequence. Every smirk, every chuckle, every thoughtless comment had led to this pause, this moment of awareness. It made the room uncomfortable not because she had accused them, but because they recognized themselves in the reflection she held up. The quiet demanded accountability, even if unspoken. It was in this silence that the story she had tried to tell fully landed. Words are fleeting, laughter is fleeting, but silence has the rare ability to linger, to let meaning settle, to create a space where understanding becomes inevitable. The room had shifted, not through confrontation, but through the gravity of someone standing in her truth, letting the absence of noise speak louder than anything else could. And within that quiet, the people who had laughed could no longer pretend. They could no longer assume. They had to reckon with the presence of someone who refused to be diminished, someone whose tears were not weakness, but clarity, and someone whose silence afterward spoke more powerfully than any response could.